Hi, and thanks so much for being here at this symposium on the Lake Tahoe West science effort. My name is Vittorio. I'm Northern California Program Manager for the National Forest Foundation, and I also serve as Project Manager for the Lake Tahoe West Restoration Partnership. Like others, I want to acknowledge the many others that have been involved in this effort to develop lessons learned for science, collaboration, and landscape restoration. The co-authors on the paper that I'm writing are Kat McIntyre of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and Shana Gross of the Forest Service, who you heard from earlier, but many other members of the Lake Tahoe West Partnership have been involved and assisted on this effort. So here's an outline of my talk. First, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Lake Tahoe West process, focusing a little bit more on some of the governance aspects. I'll explain our approach to developing these lessons learned, and then finally I'll walk us through 8 lessons learned from Lake Tahoe West. And this is a photo by the California Tahoe Conservancy of the project area, which, as others have mentioned, is on the beautiful west shore of Lake Tahoe. So first, some context on Lake Tahoe West and our governance approach. Lake Tahoe West is an agency-driven partnership initiated in 2016 to restore resilience of forests, watersheds, recreational opportunities, and communities across a 59,000-acre landscape, a complex social ecological landscape. The map shows the Lake Tahoe West boundary outlined in black. It also shows land ownership. So the primary landowner is the Forest Service, but there's also significant tracts of state lands managed by the California State Parks and the California Tahoe Conservancy, as well as private lands. In terms of this landscape as a social ecological landscape, many people live on the West Shore, either year-round or seasonally as second homeowners. The West Shore is also a huge contributor to Tahoe's recreation and tourism economy. And of course, it's also very ecologically valuable with diverse ecosystems ranging from conifer forests, aspen forests, meadows, streams and lakes, and habitat for key species like the spotted owl, Lahontan cutthroat trout, Pacific martin, and others. The partners in the governance process reflect this complex landscape. Participants include federal, state, regional agencies, and the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California. We have stakeholders representing conservation, fire protection, recreation, homeowners, businesses, scientists, and local government. The primary conveners and agency partners are shown here by their logos, and that's a mix of the main landowners plus some of the key regulatory agencies in the Lake Tahoe Basin, like the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Board, and then also the Tahoe Fire and Fuels Team and the National Forest Foundation. All of these many participants are organized into 5 interagency teams: the science team, some of whom you've seen today, of 20+ scientists, and 2 stakeholder committees. These bodies primarily operate through a consensus-seeking type of governance process. And this collaborative approach really builds on a foundation and, I would say, norm of collaboration in the Lake Tahoe Basin. There's a long history of collaborative management across agencies and also with stakeholders in the Tahoe Basin. Lake Tahoe West is currently in phase 3 of a 5-phase project. Phase 3 is project planning and analysis for a landscape scale restoration project. And as you've heard, some of the earlier phases we're really building on those to develop that landscape scale project. So phase 1 was the landscape resilience assessment that Shana talked about, and phase 2 was the landscape restoration strategy that Shana and others have also talked about today. And those were the first 2 phases of Lake Tahoe West. As I said, we're now in the project planning phase, and then following that, we will move into implementation and then monitoring and adaptive management. This slide is just to give a brief overview of the approach we've taken to develop these lessons learned. We conducted an online survey of stakeholders, managers, and scientists in the Lake Tahoe West process as this was right at the end as we wrapped up the landscape restoration strategy. And that online survey included open-ended, multiple choice, and Likert scale questions. And we had managers, scientists, and stakeholders respond to that survey in about equal proportions. Then we held a workshop to review survey findings and discuss recommendations. We have our small writing team that's writing a paper with iterative feedback from other participants in the Lake Tahoe West effort, and there are many participants in the Lake Tahoe West effort, so that iterative feedback process is really important. The primary goal of this effort is really to inform other large landscape scale collaboratives. The photo here is from NASA, which some of you may recognize, Emerald Bay, which is probably the most visited scenic part of the lake and is within our Lake Tahoe West project area. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move into the 8 lessons. And the first one is develop a common vision and understanding with a landscape assessment and landscape restoration strategy. Shana's presentation went into more detail about what these documents look like for Lake Tahoe West. But in general, the survey identified that most respondents would strongly recommend that other collaboratives develop these products. Excuse me. And there are different ways to develop these products. You might not need to do them in a fully collaborative way, but in general, the lesson is that these are really foundational products for large landscape restoration. Excuse me, I'm going to mute for a second so I can drink a little. Okay, I think I'm better now. All right, lesson 2, collaboratively develop work products to build agreement about restoration needs, goals, and approaches. There are really several specific ways, many specific ways that Lake Tahoe West collaborative process improves the quality of those 2 key documents, the landscape resilience assessment and the landscape restoration strategy. And this lesson really gets at that. So for example, we used a collaborative process to develop conceptual frameworks for both of those documents, to refine desired conditions, to develop model inputs for the modeling effort, and to interpret modeling findings. Field visits also contributed to shared understanding of field conditions and agreement around restoration strategies that could address those field conditions. So for example, that the photo is of a Lake Tahoe West field visit to a protected habitat of the northern goshawk on the west shore. And all of that work really paid off in the form of a landscape restoration strategy that has buy-in from multiple land management and regulatory agencies in the Tahoe Basin, as well as diverse stakeholder groups. And we're now using that strategy as a basis for landscape scale restoration. Oh, let me go back real quick. I have several quotes sprinkled throughout this presentation, and this one just captures the value of that collaborative approach. I feel that the landscape restoration strategy is critical to future collaboration between agencies and land managers across a given landscape. It's the only way for all parties to come together on an agreed upon approach to restoring the whole landscape, not just pieces of it. Okay, lesson 3, to ensure science is relevant to management, collaboratively identify key management needs and uncertainties before initiating new scientific studies. This lesson came up repeatedly in our survey and workshop from scientists, managers, and stakeholders, and so there's a lot of agreement here. The sub-lessons here are take time to evaluate what you have and what you need, collaboratively prioritize questions and uncertainties to address, and build a common understanding of what results will look like and how they can be translated to management. Basically, it's really important to recognize the time and resources that are required for complex science approaches and target those where they will add the most value. The Lake Tahoe West science process was highly complex and integrated, as you've seen from other presentations today. And we did a lot of great work to collaboratively guide that science. The photo is of Jonathan Long meeting with members of the Washoe tribe, where they were talking about meadow restoration indicators that we could use in Lake Tahoe West to reflect tribal cultural values. At the same time, we had some challenges with the sheer scale of the Lake Tahoe West effort. And so the quote here, I think, sums it up well. Sometimes less is more, and there shouldn't be so much modeling that it is cumbersome to develop inputs or analyze and interpret results. And sometimes participants in this effort did feel that it became cumbersome at some points. So again, the take home is that collaboratives should really take the time up front to carefully align their needs with any new scientific tools or studies that they're investing in. Okay, lesson 4, sometimes it makes sense to, not all science needs to be conducted to specifically inform management. In other words, sometimes it makes sense to conduct science in a way that's not coupled tightly with collaborative management. And there's a couple of reasons for this that, were clear from Lake Tahoe West. First, managers often need to move forward on implementing management on the ground, and science can take a long time. That insight around timeline is definitely not new or unique to Lake Tahoe West, but it's worth reiterating. Second, another consideration is matching the scale of science investigation with the scale of a collaborative's information needs. And, I think this is tricky, and as others have said today, we learned a lot as we went through the Lake Tahoe West effort. I borrowed this graphic from Jonathan's presentation just to remind folks that the modeling effort, worked at multiple scales, both temporal and spatial, with some of the modeling at a finer scale and some of the modeling focused more on the long-term landscape scale. So as you've heard today, the Lake Tahoe West modeling centered, really on an investigation of how different management approaches interact with long-term climate and disturbance dynamics at a landscape scale. And then, we also had that finer scale modeling that complemented that work. And in practice in Lake Tahoe West, we found that the finer scale results tended to be more directly applicable and useful to managers and stakeholders, whereas the landscape scale long-term results were harder to apply in a collaborative format in a directly informative way. And those are things that collaboratives and scientists should consider. Ultimately, we need landscape scale modeling to inform long-term management of these systems. The science is highly valuable and useful, but there's some challenges to coupling it with a collaborative process. And, I think it was still incredibly useful for Lake Tahoe West, but an important insight that finer scale modeling in some ways was more directly applicable and usable. Okay, lesson 5 is develop a strong interface for ongoing communication, coordination, and documenting of decisions regarding science. This lesson gets at some of the practical day-to-day things you need to do to have a successful process and a successful collaboration with scientists, I think. And actually, I think we did a pretty good job in Lake Tahoe West. We put in place some really robust mechanisms to coordinate our science effort. So for example, we had daily to weekly coordination of the science effort by a small group that was clearly tasked with that. That's bullet 1. Even so, there are, mistakes will be made, and there were a few mistakes that we learned from in Lake Tahoe West. So one of our key lessons is to make sure that decisions about model setup are clearly documented, not just in meeting notes, but also in model inputs documentation that scientists share back with managers. Especially helpful when there is staff and scientist turnover, which is a common thing that happens in a collaborative process. Another lesson is that scientists should share early model validation outputs to make sure that the model is performing in the way that that managers are seeking. So that's bullets 2 and 3, and then bullet 4, in terms of working with stakeholders, collaboratives should plan for clear communication of results and document how results informed agreements. With so many science results coming in, sometimes it was hard to track exactly how we were using those results. And it's documented to some degree in meeting notes, but a clear documentation so that you can go back to that and really say, oh, that's right, these results on water quality modeling or that result on high severity fire informed why we, took that path, a particular path in the landscape restoration strategy. Having that documented is really helpful. Okay, lesson 6, ensure participant expectations are aligned and realistic from the start, and prioritize your goals. So Lake Tahoe West is tackling many big goals. Assessing current landscape resilience, the integrated modeling effort that you've heard today to inform the landscape restoration strategy, comprehensive cross-jurisdictional planning and restoration, and integrated adaptive management. of a large-scale restoration project. Lake Tahoe West is actually on the path to achieving these ambitious goals, but it is taking a while. You know, it's taking a little bit longer than agencies originally planned for. And there's definitely been a higher level of staff commitment by agencies than I think what was originally envisioned, particularly in those first two phases of the project. And I think that's the bottom line with this lesson, that collaboratives should align what they want to do with what's possible within the time and the resources that they have, and a realistic look at, you know, how much time those efforts are going to take. And when they do that, there might be some hard prioritization and trade-offs about your goals and your process. And again, this is a great quote that sums it up really well. Lake Tahoe West could have better reconciled the desire to move quickly with the desire for fully collaborative engagement with complex, multifaceted science modeling effort. Okay. We're getting there, just two more lessons left. Lesson 7 is adaptively manage your process and match it to the level of complexity on your landscape. And there's a couple of pieces in this lesson around managing a collaborative process. First, it suggests that collaboratives should take time for regular process debriefs and use those to adjust course as needed. That's the adaptive management piece. And then second, the quote gets at matching process complexity to landscape complexity. And something for collaboratives to be mindful of, and that we definitely learned in Lake Tahoe West, is that complexity begets complexity. So the more ambitious your goals and the more elaborate your process, the more science you try to fold into that, it just becomes more challenging to manage all of that and keep it all moving smoothly forward and on time. The quote here gets at the fact that, you know, Lake Tahoe West is a complex landscape. And so to some extent, our more elaborate process was probably appropriate, and taking the time to do the landscape resilience assessment and the landscape restoration strategy before we moved into project planning probably made sense on our landscape where we had many, many entities that we needed to get buy-in from. On a less complex landscape where perhaps there's fewer stakeholders, less public spotlight, you may not need all of those steps, or you may not need to do all of those steps in as collaborative of a way. Okay. And finally, be intentional in engaging stakeholders appropriately and sustainably. And the key word here, I think, is really sustainably. Many of our stakeholders struggled to stay engaged in some of the phases of Lake Tahoe West, particularly with the science effort, because the timeline was a little bit longer than anticipated, and the content was just very, very technical. And while we had some very technically savvy stakeholders, we had others that just, you know, didn't want to or couldn't or didn't have the time to stay engaged through that. And scientists and agency managers also struggled with the heavy workload. It was a lot to triangulate this effort between scientists and stakeholders and managers and all the people that in different teams and committees that were collaborating on that. Now we're in the project planning phase, and stakeholders, you know, for a lot of our stakeholders, this is really where the rubber hits the road. What are we actually proposing to do on the ground and where? And, you know, stakeholders really want to be engaged in this phase of the project. But at the same time, you know, we have a little bit of process fatigue and collaboration fatigue because we have been working together so intensively for several years. And it's not a bad thing, but it's just something to be mindful of. The final lesson is really to streamline stakeholder approaches in earlier phases as much as possible. So, you know, you can still elicit meaningful input and broad support for products like a landscape resilience assessment and a landscape restoration strategy, with perhaps a slightly lower bar for collaborative and consensus-based decision-making than we had in Lake Tahoe West. And that can leave participants with more energy and time to continue collaboration during this critical phase that Lake Tahoe West is in right now of developing a proposed action and an environmental document. I like this picture because these are happy stakeholders. And that's what we want. Okay, so just to recap the key take-homes from my vantage point, Collaboration can help drive a common understanding and vision of the landscape and management needs. Collaboration is a major commitment. Be intentional and realistic in committing to a collaborative process. Third, take time to consider what you have and what you need before embarking on new scientific studies. Identify new science needs and approaches collaboratively. Finally, set up an effective process to coordinate science efforts within a collaborative process. Obviously, every collaborative is different and the approach should be tailored to that unique context, but we hope these lessons are useful for other collaboratives working to restore large landscapes. And with that, I'll wrap up. I'd like to acknowledge these funders of the Lake Tahoe West collaborative process and much of the science, the California Tahoe Conservancy, Forest Service Region 5, Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and the Washington office, and the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act via the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. Thanks, and you can find my contact information. You can also find Lake Tahoe West online at laketahoewest.org, and we have links there to all the various documents we've been talking about today. That's it.